In a world where the perfect family seems like an unbreakable fortress, the scars of betrayal often hide behind smiles and shared photographs. What if everything you loved turned out to be a lie? Picture this: a warm evening at a family gathering, children laughing, and the voices of loved ones enveloping you in comfort. Yet behind this facade, whispers, fleeting glances, and laughter that conceals something more. This story delves into how a single moment can unravel years of trust and trigger an avalanche of revelations. At the heart of the narrative is a man whose life crumbles to pieces, but his fight for truth and inner peace is only just beginning. Are you ready to dive into the depths of his emotions? My dear friend, be sure to subscribe to my channel if this is your first time here, and give your royal like to this video. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the garden in a warm glow, casting a serene radiance over the gathering of relatives. The mingling scents of barbecue smoke and blooming flowers hung in the air, mingling with the lively hum of conversation. Children darted between tables in a spirited game of tag, their laughter rising above the murmur of voices. This family reunion, a tradition cherished for 20 years, felt both familiar and fleeting. Caleb lingered near the drinks table, absently swirling a glass of iced tea. His eyes followed his wife, Jenny, as she moved gracefully through the crowd. Her laughter, bright and melodic, carried a hint of exaggeration, like a note played slightly too loud. Their children, Thomas, Anthony, and Lucy, flitted about with their cousins, carefree and full of energy. At the center of the gathering, Charles commanded attention, weaving one of his legendary tales. The group surrounding him erupted into laughter and applause as he delivered his punchline with practiced flair. Caleb joined the circle, offering a polite chuckle at the story's climax. Yet he couldn't ignore the way Charles's arm brushed against Jenny's shoulder, or how she leaned in close to whisper something that drew an amused laugh from him. The sight unsettled Caleb, though he quickly dismissed the feeling. He turned to Hazel, an elderly aunt seated nearby, seeking a distraction. "You've really outdone yourself, Hazel," he said warmly. "It's a wonderful gathering." "Thank you, Caleb," she replied with a kind smile, but his attention strayed back to Jenny. She caught his eye and waved, though the gesture felt more like an acknowledgement than a connection. Determined to engage, Caleb circulated through the crowd, but his thoughts remained tethered elsewhere. A distant cousin clapped him on the back. "Thomas is growing up to be a fine young man. You must be proud," he said with a nostalgic smile. "He's the spitting image of his father, isn't he?" "Sure," Caleb replied, his voice neutral. The comment struck a nerve, echoing similar remarks he had heard before. While he had always brushed them aside, they now carried an uncomfortable weight. His musings were interrupted by Jenny's approach, her smile bright but strained. "Caleb," she called cheerfully, "could you grab more wine from the cellar? We're running low." "Of course," he said, studying her face. Her eyes darted away briefly. "Don't take too long," she added, her tone laced with a false buoyancy as she disappeared back into the crowd. Caleb made his way toward the cellar, but his steps faltered when Thomas, Anthony, and Lucy appeared beside him. "Want some help, Dad?" Thomas offered, his voice unusually tight. "We can come with you," Anthony chimed in, though there was something rehearsed in his tone. Caleb glanced at them, sensing a forced politeness. "I've got it," he said, waving them off. Their gazes lingered on him as he turned to the basement door. At the threshold, Caleb paused, his hand resting on the worn brass doorknob. The faint sounds of the party filtered through, the clink of glasses, bursts of laughter. Yet beneath the revelry, a softer, more intimate murmur caught his attention. His chest tightened as he pushed the door open, the hinges groaning softly. The muffled noise of the reunion faded as the door shut behind him. Descending the creaking stairs, Caleb entered the dimly lit basement. A single bulb cast a feeble glow over dusty boxes and forgotten furniture, its light barely cutting through the shadows. The faint sound of voices reached his ears, Jenny's laugh, unmistakable, followed by the low, familiar tone of Charles. Their words were indistinct, but the playful intimacy in their exchange was unmistakable. Caleb's foot met the cold concrete floor and he froze. His heart thudded in his chest as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. Ahead, in a shaft of faint light, stood Jenny in Charles's arms. Their closeness, the shared moment between them, shattered something within Caleb. He stood rooted to the spot, the fragile harmony of the afternoon unraveling before him. They turned sharply at the sound of his sudden, ragged gasp, the noise slicing through the oppressive tension like a blade. Jenny's eyes met his, but instead of fear or guilt, her expression carried a knowing smirk that sent a chill racing through his body. Faint voices rose from the stairwell below, their urgent tones stoking the chaos already swirling inside Caleb's chest. He immediately recognized the playful cadence of Jenny's voice, threaded seamlessly with Charles's calm, self-assured tone. Caleb halted mid-step, his hand gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles turned pale. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to walk away and pretend he hadn't heard, but a darker urge held him in place, compelling him to hear more. "You're pushing your luck, Charles," Jenny said, her tone light but edged with a warning. "Oh, don't be like that," Charles replied smoothly. "Admit it. You thrive on the thrill. You always have." Jenny's laugh echoed up the stairwell, a sound Caleb hadn't heard from her in years, carefree and genuine. "We can't afford to get sloppy," she said, her voice dipping into something more serious. "Caleb isn't as oblivious as you think." Charles let out a low chuckle, tinged with arrogance. 20 years, Jenny, and he still buys every act we put on. He's a tool, nothing more." Caleb's grip on the banister tightened as his breathing grew uneven. Rage churned within him, but he stayed rooted, forcing himself to keep listening. Slowly, he descended the stairs, each step deliberate and silent. When he reached the bottom, Jenny's tone shifted, sharper now. "Hush, he could be listening." Whatever Charles was about to say was cut off as Caleb stepped into view. Jenny spun around, her expression flickering between surprise and resolve before settling into a cold, unreadable mask. Charles, standing close beside her, didn't even bother to hide his irritation, his smirk fading into a look of casual annoyance. "Well," Jenny said at last, her voice carrying a strange blend of defiance and relief, "I guess there's no point in hiding anymore." Caleb's throat felt tight as he tried to find his voice. What is this?" he asked hoarsely, the words barely escaping his lips. Jenny tilted her head, her smirk deepening into something cruel. "It's the truth, Caleb," she said simply. "Consider it the end of your little fantasy." She crossed her arms and exchanged a glance with Charles, who offered a nonchalant shrug. Caleb's heart pounded as he repeated his question, louder this time. "What is this?" Jenny's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a twisted sort of amusement. "Oh, Caleb," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "You can't really be this clueless, can you?" Charles stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate, his voice smooth and cutting. "Come on, Caleb," he said, shaking his head. "It's been a farce for years. Did you honestly think you could keep living this lie forever?" Caleb's hands curled into fists, his body trembling with restrained fury. "How long?" he demanded, his voice cracking as the weight of the question settled over them. Jenny paused as if considering the answer, before replying with a breezy indifference. "Before Thomas was born," she said casually. "So what? About 20 years?" The words hit Caleb like a physical blow, the world around him spinning. "And the kids?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Charles answered without hesitation. "They're mine. All of them, and they've known for years." Staggering backward, Caleb collided with a nearby shelf, his legs barely holding him up. "You let me believe, all this time. You let me think they were mine," he said, his voice thick with anguish. Jenny's face remained impassive as she shrugged. "You were convenient, Caleb. A good provider, that's all." A wave of fury surged through him, overpowering the pain. "I loved you. I loved them," he choked out, his voice cracking under the strain. "How could you do this to me?" Jenny's expression darkened, her tone cutting through him like a blade. "You loved the idea of us, the picture-perfect family. But you never really saw us for who we are, did you? Charles chuckled softly, stepping closer with a calm that only deepened Caleb's torment. Face it, brother, he said, his voice smooth and unfeeling. You were nothing but a placeholder. Caleb stared at them, his chest heaving as the weight of their betrayal crushed him. The cold reality of their words wrapped around his soul, splintering it into pieces too jagged to ever mend. In the stillness, the creak of footsteps descending the stairs shattered the silence. Caleb turned sharply, his pulse racing, and saw Thomas, Anthony, and Lucy standing shoulder to shoulder at the base of the staircase. Their faces were unreadable, stripped of warmth, and exuded an unnerving detachment. For a brief, desperate moment, Caleb clung to the faint hope that they were still unaware of his betrayal. He reached out toward them, his voice strained with urgency. Please hear me out, he implored, his words trembling under the weight of his fear. Whatever you think you know. Thomas stepped forward, a bitter smirk playing on his lips. Spare us the humiliation, he cut in sharply. We know everything. The declaration struck Caleb like a physical blow. His stomach churned as he forced the words out, his voice faltering. What are you saying? Anthony, the middle child, crossed his arms, his expression colder than Caleb had ever seen before. We've always known, he stated plainly. Uncle Charles is our real father. You were just the one who footed the bills. Lucy's gaze turned frostier, and her voice sliced through him. We don't need you. We never did. You were nothing to us. Her words landed with a devastating finality, piercing deeper than any betrayal by Jenny or Charles ever could. Caleb felt his legs weaken beneath him as he tried to comprehend their cutting accusations. But I was there for you, he stammered, his voice breaking. I raised you. I loved you. Thomas sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. Did you really believe that was enough? You were just a means to an end, and now we're done. The weight of their words pressed down on him as silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Caleb's breath hitched as he turned his gaze toward Jenny and Charles, seeking even a trace of remorse. His voice, raw and trembling, broke the quiet. You've ruined everything, he whispered. Jenny rolled her eyes, her tone laced with irritation. Don't be so dramatic, Caleb, she replied dismissively. You've always been blind to the truth, and you still are. Charles's smirk widened, oozing arrogance. It's over, he declared with finality. You can leave now. A surge of anger flared in Caleb, burning away the numbness. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto his brother's with fierce intensity. You think this ends here? He asked, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. You think I'll just disappear? Charles met his stare with cool indifference. What can you possibly do? It's already over. We've won. Caleb's hands curled into fists, the desire to strike Charles almost overwhelming, but he held back, knowing that reacting in anger would only feed their victory. Swallowing his fury, he turned toward the stairs, his movements heavy and deliberate. Behind him, Jenny's mocking voice sliced through the air. Running away already? I thought you'd at least fight for the scraps of your dignity. He paused, but didn't turn to face her. His voice was low, each word deliberate and sharp. You'll pay for this, he said, and then began ascending the stairs, each step carrying the weight of his resolve. At the top, he turned back one last time, taking in the sight of them, his wife, his brother, and his children, standing united in their betrayal. The image seared itself into his memory, a scar he would carry forever. Without another word, he shut the door behind him and walked away. As he stepped into the midst of the party, the lively atmosphere seemed distant, muted by the storm raging in his mind. Laughter, music, and conversation blurred into background noise. A distant relative raised a glass in greeting, but Caleb's nod was perfunctory, his focus elsewhere. His thoughts were already racing. He would not let this treachery go unanswered. For too long he had been their pawn, but that era of his life was over. Outside, the cold night air bit into his skin as he leaned against his car, the cool metal grounding him momentarily. Still, his mind swirled with turmoil. His entire life, his family, his marriage, his identity, had been built on deceit, every memory tainted by their lies. Images of his past flashed in his mind like cruel fragments of a broken mirror. Jenny's radiant smile on their wedding day, the overwhelming joy of holding Thomas as a newborn, the laughter and togetherness of family vacations. Each recollection, once cherished, now felt twisted, hollow. Caleb drew in a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling in uneven waves. He didn't know yet what his next move would be, but one thing burned clearly in his mind. This was not the end. Caleb's jaw tightened until it felt on the verge of cracking, the bitter sting of betrayal weighing on him like an unrelenting burden. His mind swirled with chaotic, suffocating thoughts until a distant voice broke through the storm. "Caleb." Gabriel, his cousin, approached cautiously, his voice laced with concern. "Are you okay? What's going on?" Caleb didn't respond. Instead, he turned silently and climbed into his car. The door slammed shut with a resolute finality, and moments later the tires screeched as he sped off into the night. The streets blurred into a stream of light and shadow, his destination unimportant. He needed movement, an escape from the suffocating reality crushing him. That night, sleep proved impossible. Caleb sat in the dim light of his living room, surrounded by the faint glow of old photo albums scattered across the coffee table. Each page he turned was a fresh wound, a new betrayal etched into his heart. Photos of Jenny's radiant smile, the kids blowing out birthday candles, and Charles standing by his side at countless family gatherings now seemed like cruel mockeries. His hands trembled as he lingered over a photo of Thomas as a baby, remembering the pride and love he once felt. How had he been so blind to the deceit lurking behind those moments? By morning, Caleb's resolve had hardened. There would be no reconciliation, no attempts at understanding, and certainly no forgiveness. His love had been weaponized against him, and he refused to be the fool any longer. 2 days later, Caleb found himself sitting across from his lawyer. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee, and the walls were lined with framed degrees that only emphasized the sterile atmosphere. Isaac Miller, his lawyer, regarded him with careful professionalism. "I want this resolved quickly," Caleb said, his voice devoid of warmth. Isaac adjusted his glasses, reading the seriousness in Caleb's tone. "Are you ready to proceed with the divorce?" "Yes," Caleb replied, his tone steady and unyielding. "And I want my will revised." Isaac hesitated. "You're cutting everyone out?" Caleb's gaze hardened, his expression cold. "Jenny, Charles, the kids, all of them. I don't want any of them to see a cent." Isaac opened his mouth to protest, but Caleb's icy stare silenced him. "Just do it," Caleb said curtly. As Isaac scribbled notes, Caleb's thoughts wandered. Jenny and Charles's betrayal had cut him deeply, but the children's disloyalty had been the cruelest blow. He had been a father to them in every way that mattered, only to be discarded, as if his love meant nothing. That searing pain transformed into a steely determination. They would all feel the consequences of their actions. Within days, Jenny received the divorce papers. Caleb made sure they were delivered to their shared home, a place now steeped in bitterness. Her reaction was immediate and frantic. She flooded him with calls, her messages a mixture of pleading and desperation. He listened to one before deleting the rest. "Caleb, please." Her voice trembled in the voicemail. "I know you're hurt, but we need to talk. The kids need us to figure this out." His finger hovered over the delete button for a split second before he erased it. He couldn't afford to let her words weaken his resolve. Jenny escalated her efforts, showing up unannounced at his office. Security had to remove her, her anguished cries echoing through the building as she called his name. The hushed whispers of his colleagues reached his ears, but Caleb remained fixated on the work in front of him, refusing to let her see even a hint of his turmoil. Then came Charles. Once, Caleb had trusted his younger brother enough to grant him a significant share in the family business, a gesture of love and confidence. That trust had turned to ash. Acting swiftly, Caleb convened an emergency board meeting. By the meeting's end, Charles's shares had been liquidated, leaving him financially ruined. The fallout was swift and ruthless. News of Charles's abrupt downfall spread quickly, and Caleb imagined his brother's shock, disbelief, and the bitter sting of humiliation. It didn't erase the pain of betrayal, but it was a small measure of justice. A week later, the children appeared. Caleb sat in silence within the walls of his new apartment. The space, humble and unassuming, felt like a world apart from the home he had left behind. The quiet was broken by a firm knock at the door, sharp and insistent. He knew immediately who it was. For a fleeting moment, he considered ignoring it, letting the visitors linger outside until they gave up. But instead, he stood, his face a mask of indifference, and opened the door. Standing before him were Thomas, Anthony, and Lucy. Their expressions were a mixture of uncertainty and defiance, a blend Caleb had grown familiar with. Thomas was the first to step forward, attempting to muster an air of authority in his voice. "We need to talk." Caleb's reply was cold and measured. "About what?" "Mom says you're being unreasonable," Anthony chimed in, his words laced with frustration. "We need to sort this out." Caleb's gaze turned steely. "Sort what out? You all made your choice." The tension in the room thickened until Lucy broke the silence, her voice softer than the others. "We're still your kids." Caleb's response came swiftly, his tone calm yet unyielding. "No, you were never mine." The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a final verdict. Thomas's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Fine," he spat, "if that's how you want it." Without waiting for a reply, the three turned and walked away. Caleb closed the door behind them, leaning against it as the gravity of the encounter settled over him. Yet the relief he'd expected didn't come. Neither did satisfaction. All that remained was an aching void. The weeks that followed blurred together, filled with endless paperwork and an aching sense of isolation. Caleb sold the house, cutting the last remaining tie to his former life. Friends and family reached out, their calls persistent at first, then sporadic, before fading into silence. He ignored them all. He needed the solitude, the space to rebuild what had been shattered. In those still, lonely hours, when the bitterness of betrayal threatened to consume him, Caleb clung to a single, unshakable truth. He had survived. They had taken advantage of him, broken his trust, but he had endured. And now, it was time to begin again. The years that followed tested him in every way imaginable. Caleb faced the remnants of his old life head-on, determined to forge a new path. It was anything but easy. Some mornings the weight of his losses felt unbearable, pinning him to the bed. But every day he forced himself to rise, to move forward. Therapy became an anchor in his tumultuous journey. Dr. Brown, his sharp-eyed, no-nonsense therapist, refused to let him wallow in self-pity or retreat behind his defenses. "They took advantage of you," she said bluntly during one session. "But that's on them. It doesn't define who you are." At first, Caleb resisted her words, unwilling to let go of his anger. But over time, they began to sink in. He poured his pain and frustration into his work, pushing his business to new heights with unwavering determination. His relentless drive earned him a reputation as a tough but capable leader. Outside of work, he found solace in boxing, each punch and movement serving as a cathartic release. He explored places he'd only dreamed of, finding a strange peace in the quiet solitude of his travels. And then, unexpectedly, love found him again. At a charity gala, he met Victoria, a woman whose sharp wit was matched by her boundless compassion. Their relationship grew slowly, Caleb cautious and guarded, but Victoria never rushed him. One evening, as they strolled along a quiet beach under the moonlight, she took his hand and spoke softly. "You don't have to carry all of this alone." In that moment, Caleb felt the beginnings of release, a small but significant step toward letting go. 5 years passed, marked by steady growth and quiet healing. Caleb rebuilt his life piece by piece, carefully choosing who to let into his inner world. Then, on a cold evening, a familiar sound shattered the peace, a knock at the door. Caleb paused mid-sip of his coffee, his body tensing. Visitors were rare, and he had worked hard to ensure they remained so. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with Thomas, Anthony, and Lucy. Their presence stirred a storm of emotions he thought he'd buried. Anger, sadness, confusion. But he kept his expression unreadable. Time had changed them. Thomas's once confident posture had given way to weariness, his clothes disheveled. Anthony avoided eye contact, his hands fidgeting in discomfort. Lucy lingered at the back, arms wrapped around herself, her guarded eyes betraying an unease Caleb couldn't ignore. And just like that, the past he had fought so hard to leave behind stood on his doorstep, waiting to be confronted once more. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice rough and strained. "We need to talk, Caleb." Caleb's arms folded across his chest as he replied, his tone clipped and unwavering. "I'm not your father." Thomas faltered but pressed forward. "We've fallen on hard times." Caleb's expression stayed impassive, his voice cutting through the air. "That's not exactly shocking," he said dryly. "Get to the point." Anthony stepped in, his voice shaking. "It's about Mom and Charles. Things are bad, really bad. They've lost everything." Caleb raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. Finally, Lucy managed to speak, her voice trembling. "We need help. There's no money for college. We're stuck." Caleb's brittle laugh sliced through the tension. "College?" he sneered. "You're coming to me for money after everything?" Thomas's eyes flared with anger. "You owe us," he shot back. "You raised us. You can't just abandon us like this." "Owe you?" Caleb's voice dropped into a chilling calm as he stepped closer, making them shrink away. "Let me make this clear. I don't owe you anything. Not a single cent." Anthony shifted uncomfortably, his voice quiet but firm. "We made mistakes," he admitted. "We get that now, but we're still family." Caleb let out a bitter chuckle, devoid of any warmth. "Family?" he echoed, the word dripping with disbelief. "Is that what you call the way you treated me? Shutting me out? Using me as nothing more than a wallet?" Lucy wiped at her tears. "We were just kids," she murmured. "We didn't understand what we were doing." For a brief moment, Caleb's cold gaze softened, but memories of being excluded and belittled quickly hardened his expression again. "You made your choice," he said icily. "Now you get to live with it." Thomas's desperation gave way to fury. "So that's how it is?" he snapped. "You're just going to stand there and let us suffer? Prove Mom right that you're spiteful and small?" Caleb's face became an unreadable mask, his voice void of emotion. "I'm done being your scapegoat," he said flatly. Without waiting for a response, Caleb turned toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob. "Wait!" Lucy cried, lunging forward. "Please don't shut us out! We have nothing left!" Caleb paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as he stood there, unmoving. Then, without a word, he pushed the door shut. The sound of the door closing reverberated through the hallway, where muffled voices grew frantic. Caleb leaned against the door, his breathing uneven. He had imagined this moment countless times, turning them away, forcing them to feel even a fraction of the hurt they had caused him. But now that it had come to pass, all he felt was an overwhelming emptiness. He remained there for what seemed like hours, as their voices faded, eventually replaced by silence. The quiet pressed against him, suffocating in its intensity. He had won, hadn't he? He had built a life free of their influence, a life that didn't rely on their validation. He wasn't their pawn anymore. And yet, his victory felt unbearably hollow. When he finally returned to the living room, Victoria was there, her eyes filled with gentle concern. She stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Caleb closed his eyes, clinging to her as his voice wavered. "I don't know," he confessed. He had broken free from the chains of his past, but the scars they left behind would stay with him, a constant reminder of the pain he had endured. Caleb had painstakingly rebuilt himself from the wreckage of betrayal, but the road to recovery was anything but straightforward. He had sought retribution and achieved it, though the cost of his actions weighed heavily on him. Answers eluded him, save for one certainty: he was pressing forward, step by determined step. So when Jenny showed up at his door, he wasn't surprised. Deep down, he had anticipated this moment, as though it were an inevitable chapter in their shared history. Word of his confrontation with the kids must have reached her ears, and desperation had driven her here. When he opened the door, she stood before him, a pale shadow of the vibrant woman she once was. Her eyes, once alive with confidence, were now swollen and bloodshot, worn down by tears. Her clothing was as disheveled as her spirit, rumpled and lifeless, a stark contrast to the poised and commanding figure he remembered. The radiant Jenny who could light up any room was gone, replaced by someone who seemed drained and hollow. "Caleb," she said softly, her voice fragile and on the verge of breaking. She took a hesitant step forward, but he stood firm, blocking her path. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his face a mask of cold indifference. "What do you want?" His voice was sharp, devoid of warmth. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of his hostility. I need to talk," she managed to say. "Talk?" he echoed with a bitter laugh. "That's ironic. You were never interested in talking before." "Please," she pleaded, her voice trembling as she drew a shaky breath. Then, to his shock, she sank to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed openly. "I was wrong, Caleb. We were all wrong." Watching her crumble before him sent a torrent of emotions crashing over him. Anger, disgust, and a fleeting trace of pity that he quickly buried. He refused to let her glimpse any weakness. Her hands trembled as she reached out toward him. "I have nothing left," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The business is gone. Charles is a mess. The kids, they're suffering. I can't do this alone." His jaw clenched, and his words cut like a blade. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about it?" Her gaze met his, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes. "Help us, please. You're the only one who can." He didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between them like a chasm. Once, he would have done anything for her, moved mountains, built a future. He had trusted her, loved her, and built a life with her. But that was before it all came crashing down. Before he walked in on her with Charles, before the children he thought were his turned their backs on him. The memories churned within him, burning like poison. "Do you remember that night?" he asked, his voice low and edged with menace. "The night I found out. The way you looked at me, like you were proud of what you'd done." Jenny flinched as though he had struck her. "I was cruel," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I wanted to hurt you because I was hurting." His laughter was bitter and sharp. "Hurting? That's your excuse? You think that justifies anything?" "No," she said quickly, her tears flowing faster. "It doesn't. Nothing justifies it. I was selfish and I destroyed everything we had. I see that now." He stepped closer, his eyes piercing hers. "Did you see it when you lied to me every day? When you let me believe I was their father? When you made me into a fool?" She crumpled further, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. "I regret it every single day. I was blind, Caleb. I was stupid. I thought I could have it all." "And you did," he said, his voice colder than ice. "For a while. But even that wasn't enough for you, was it?" "No," she whispered, her voice breaking into a barely audible confession. "It was never enough. It could never be enough." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with truth and despair. The wind stirred, scattering dry leaves across the ground. Caleb wanted to leave, to walk away and shut the door on her and the past. But something held him there, an invisible tether binding him to this moment. He had to hear every word, no matter how much it hurt. The silence between them was thick and oppressive, broken only by his question, delivered in a flat, detached tone. "How long?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper, uncertain of his meaning. "What are you asking?" "How long were you with him?" The venom in his words was unmistakable, seeping into the cracks of her resolve. Jenny's eyes squeezed shut, as though bracing herself for the blow her confession would deliver. Her voice trembled as she admitted, "From the beginning, even before we got married." The floor seemed to shift beneath Caleb's feet, his balance faltering as the enormity of her admission hit him. That single word, before, pierced him like a knife. His breath caught, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "It was a mistake," Jenny stammered, desperation edging into her voice. "Something I couldn't control. It spiraled out of my hands. I tried to stop it, Caleb, I really did, but I didn't have the strength." Her words sounded empty, drowned by the roar of his anger building within. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and he shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "You stole everything from me," he said, his voice quaking with emotion. "You let me live a lie." "I know," she whispered. Jenny crumpled to her knees, clutching at his pants as if to anchor herself. Her sobs were raw, her tears staining the fabric as she pleaded. "I know, and I hate myself for it." Caleb recoiled from her grasp, yanking his leg away with a sharp motion. "Don't touch me." Her shoulders sagged, trembling under the weight of her sorrow. "Please, Caleb," she begged, her voice fractured. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I understand that. But I need you to listen, for the children's sake, if nothing else." The mention of their children lit a fire in his chest. His voice turned cold, laced with bitter resentment. "The children? You mean the ones who called me nothing more than a paycheck? The ones who turned their backs on me for him?" "They didn't know what they were saying," Jenny protested weakly, her voice breaking under the strain. "He manipulated them. They were just confused." "They knew enough," Caleb replied, his tone icy and unrelenting. "And so did you." He turned his back on her, unwilling to meet her tear-streaked face. After a moment, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I've rebuilt my life, Jenny. I clawed my way out of the wreckage you left behind. And now you're here, expecting me to do what? Sweep up the pieces? Pretend none of this happened?" She shook her head, desperation evident in every syllable. "Not for me. For them. They're still your children, Caleb." His gaze hardened as he turned to face her. "No," he said, his voice like steel. "They're not." Jenny's expression crumbled, her tears flowing freely as she choked out a response. "I understand," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I deserve this, but don't let them suffer for my mistakes." Caleb's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "You made them suffer, Jenny," he spat. "When you dragged them into this mess, when you used them as pawns to keep your lies afloat." Her head bowed, her posture sinking under the weight of his words. "I thought I could fix this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I can't. Not without you." "There's nothing left to fix," Caleb replied, his tone resolute. "There's only moving forward." He stepped back toward the doorway, his face devoid of emotion. "You made your choices, Jenny. All of you did." Her final plea came in a shattered whisper. "Please, I'm so sorry." "No," Caleb said firmly, his tone devoid of sympathy. "You're sorry because you lost. That's not the same as regret." He closed the door behind him, the sound final and definitive. It echoed like the conclusion of a story that had run its course. On the other side, her muffled sobs lingered for a moment before fading into silence. Caleb stood still, listening to the quiet that followed. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared out at the fading light beyond the window. The chapter had ended, the past finally locked away. But as he held the glass, he realized the victory felt hollow, cold and empty, tinged with bitterness. In the days that followed, Caleb began to shed the weight of those years, letting the anger and pain gradually fade. Each morning he reminded himself to focus on the future, moving forward one small step at a time. The road to healing was anything but simple. It meandered unpredictably, leading Caleb through periods of doubt and unforeseen challenges. Yet his resolve never wavered. He threw himself into his work, growing his company while mentoring young entrepreneurs. Beyond the office, he found solace in hiking, a newfound passion that brought him both peace and a sense of achievement. One brisk morning, the aroma of pine trees mingled with the crisp mountain air as Caleb reached the top of a trail. That's when he saw her. She stood at the edge of a rocky ledge, the wind tousling her auburn hair, her gaze fixed on the sweeping hills stretching endlessly before her. The quiet intensity of her presence captivated him. He hesitated, unsure if he should disturb her solitude. But before he could step back, she turned and caught his eye, offering him a warm, genuine smile. "It's breathtaking, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft but sure. "It really is," Caleb replied, taking a tentative step closer. "It never gets old." She extended her hand, her expression open and inviting. "I'm Layla." "Caleb," he said, shaking her hand. Then, with a mix of nerves and curiosity, he added, "Do you come here often?" Layla laughed lightly, a sound both melodic and teasing. "Is that your way of asking if I'm a hiker, or just wondering if you've missed me before?" Caught off guard, Caleb laughed, a deep, unguarded laugh that felt strange but refreshing. "Maybe a bit of both." The two talked for hours, perched on the rocks as the sun rose higher in the sky. Caleb started cautiously, sharing only fragments of his story, but Layla's compassionate presence encouraged him to open up more freely. She listened intently, offering words of wisdom or quiet support when needed. As they made their way back down the trail together, Caleb noticed something profound. The heavy shadows of regret and the pain of old wounds seemed lighter, almost distant. In the days and weeks that followed, his connection with Layla deepened. Her wit, empathy, and unflinching honesty consistently surprised him. She had a knack for grounding him, challenging him when he tried to retreat into himself. "You can't keep running from your past," she told him one evening over dinner, "but you don't have to let it define you either." Trust, however, was Caleb's greatest obstacle. His fears surfaced unpredictably, questions about whether he could endure another heartbreak or if history would repeat itself. When he finally shared these fears with Layla, he braced himself for rejection. Instead, she held his hand and said softly, "I'm not her, and you're not who you were. We'll figure this out together." And they did. Together, they committed to therapy, navigating challenges as a team. They learned to communicate honestly, embrace their differences, and support each other through moments of doubt. A year later, Caleb proposed in an unassuming but heartfelt gesture. There was no spectacle, just a quiet moment filled with sincerity and raw emotion, leaving them both in tears. One sunny afternoon, while Caleb worked in his study, he noticed an envelope slide under the door. His breath caught when he recognized the handwriting. It was from Thomas. The letter was long, filled with remorse and painful truths. Thomas admitted his wrongs, his unwavering loyalty to their mother and Charles, the harsh words he'd spoken, and the years wasted in silence. He detailed the struggles he'd faced, financial ruin, broken dreams, and an unrelenting sense of regret. He wasn't asking for money or forgiveness, only for the chance to talk. Caleb read the letter 3 times, his emotions swirling. First came anger, fueled by memories of pleading for understanding only to be rejected. But as the anger subsided, a spark of something else emerged: hope. Could Thomas truly comprehend the harm he had inflicted? That evening, Caleb sat on the porch, staring into the horizon as the sun began to set. Layla joined him, sitting quietly by his side. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly. Without speaking, he handed her the letter. She read it carefully, then placed it down and turned to him. "What do you think you'll do?" He exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Part of me wants to hate him. I swore I'd never let him back in." "And now?" she asked gently. His gaze lingered on the fading light. For the first time in years, he wasn't certain if his heart still held the same resolve. Caleb sat quietly for what felt like an eternity. At last he spoke, his voice barely audible. "No," he murmured, trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can forgive." Layla's gaze softened, but her words carried an unwavering resolve. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," she said gently. "And it's not about excusing what happened. It's about deciding how much power you want to give it over your life." Her hand rested lightly on his, steadying him as his thoughts churned. Memories of isolation within his own family rushed to Caleb's mind. The betrayal had cut deep, leaving a jagged scar that still ached. Yet even the deepest wounds could heal, though the process was slow and painful. What Caleb couldn't decide was whether to risk trusting Thomas again, opening himself to potential hurt, or keep his distance to preserve his fragile peace. Days passed before he made his choice. Finally, he reached out to Thomas and arranged to meet at a small cafe, marking their first encounter in 5 years. When Thomas arrived, Caleb almost didn't recognize him. His face bore the marks of age and regret, lines etched deep by hardship. They sat across from one another in a tense silence, unspoken words hanging heavily between them. "I meant every word I wrote," Thomas said eventually, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. Honestly, I don't even know why you agreed to meet me." Caleb's expression remained unreadable as he studied him. "I needed to see for myself if you were sincere," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "I had to know." Thomas nodded quickly, his tone earnest. "I am sincere," he said. "I meant every word." Caleb's face hardened. "You hurt me. All of you did. I trusted you, and you threw that trust away," he said, his voice steady but cutting. Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely holding. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to tell you how sorry I am." Caleb sat quietly for a moment, his gaze piercing. "I can't promise things will go back to the way they were," he said at last. "Too much has happened." "I understand," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "But I want to try. Whatever it takes. However long it takes." Caleb nodded slowly. "It'll take time," he warned. Relief washed over Thomas's face as he murmured a heartfelt, "Thank you." The road to rebuilding their relationship was long and fraught with obstacles. But for the first time, Caleb felt a glimmer of hope that healing might be within reach. With Layla's steady support, he began to take steps toward reconciliation, not to restore what had been, but to build something entirely new. It was a daunting journey, but one he finally felt ready to embark upon. As the years passed, Caleb's life found a quiet, steady rhythm. He built a foundation of love, resilience, and hard-earned peace. He and Layla grew closer, their bond strengthened by trust and mutual support. Though the scars of betrayal remained, they no longer dictated his life. Then, one day, a knock at the door shattered the calm he had fought so hard to establish. Opening it, Caleb was met with a face from his past, a man whose hollow cheeks and streaks of gray betrayed years of hardship. It was Charles. The years had stripped him of his once confident demeanor, leaving behind a weary and desperate shadow of the man Caleb remembered. A wave of conflicting emotions swept over Caleb: anger, disgust, and an unexpected flicker of pity. For a moment, Caleb considered slamming the door shut, but he didn't. He stood firm, his voice cold and clipped. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Charles glanced around nervously as though fearing he'd been followed. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone hesitant. "There's nothing to discuss," Caleb replied sharply, his grip tightening on the doorknob. "Please," Charles pleaded, his voice cracking. "It's about Jenny, about everything." Against his better judgment, Caleb stepped aside and gestured for Charles to enter. The tension followed them into the living room, where Caleb gestured toward a chair. But Charles remained standing, as though he couldn't bear the luxury of sitting. "Say whatever it is you came to say," Caleb said, keeping his distance. Charles ran a hand through his graying hair, his fingers trembling. "You were right to shut me out," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were right to hate me. I deserved it. But there's something you don't know, something I need to tell you." "Then get to the point," Caleb snapped, his patience wearing thin. Charles took a shaky breath, bracing himself for the weight of his own words. Charles's confession sliced through the charged atmosphere like a razor. "I lied to Jenny," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. Caleb's eyes narrowed, his tone cutting. "What do you mean? Start from the beginning." Drawing a deep, uneasy breath, Charles hesitated before speaking. "I manipulated her. I fed her lies about you, lies that weren't true. Caleb's jaw tightened. What kind of lies? Charles swallowed hard, his shame palpable. I made her believe you were cold, unfeeling. I told her you were unfaithful, that you didn't love her, that she was nothing more than a trophy to you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Caleb felt as if the floor beneath him had shifted, his chest tightening with the weight of Charles's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and laced with menace. Why would you do that? Charles hesitated, then finally answered, his voice trembling. Because I wanted her. I've always been jealous of you, of everything you've achieved. You were the golden child, the one everyone looked up to. I couldn't stand it. In my envy, I twisted the truth, made her doubt you at every opportunity. Caleb's fists clenched as his body trembled with barely contained rage. So you poisoned her mind, destroyed everything we had? His voice cracked, his anger mingling with hurt. Charles nodded, his face ashen with regret. Yes, but it doesn't excuse what she did. She still made her choices, but I made it easier for her. I planted the seeds of doubt at every turn. Caleb's mind raced, memories of his fractured relationship with Jenny crashing over him like waves. The betrayal had already carved deep scars, but now, knowing his own brother had orchestrated it, the pain was almost unbearable. He felt an overwhelming urge to strike back, to make Charles feel the torment he had caused, yet his body remained frozen in a storm of fury and exhaustion. And what? Caleb asked bitterly after a long pause. Do you think telling me this now will fix anything? No, Charles said quickly, shaking his head. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't even expect you to care. I've lost everything, Caleb. I just needed you to know it was all my fault. Caleb's gaze was unyielding, his expression unreadable. It doesn't absolve her. It doesn't make her innocent. I know, Charles admitted, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. But I couldn't bear it alone anymore. Caleb exhaled slowly, his voice steely when he finally spoke. Get out. Charles hesitated. Caleb, I said get out! Caleb roared, his voice echoing through the room like a thunderclap. As the door clicked shut behind Charles, Caleb sank onto the couch, his body racked by a torrent of emotions. The memories, the betrayal, the lingering questions, all of it churned within him, each thought more painful than the last. Later that night, Caleb shared the ordeal with Layla. Though his voice was calm, the turmoil in his eyes betrayed his inner chaos. She listened intently, her quiet presence grounding him in the midst of his storm. What are you feeling? She asked gently, her tone full of understanding. I don't know, he admitted after a moment. Anger, sadness, exhaustion. But none of it changes what happened. It doesn't make anything better. No, it doesn't, she said, placing her hand over his in a gesture of comfort. But maybe it's a step toward finding peace with it. He looked at her, his expression raw. How? How do you make peace with years of lies and betrayal? You decide how much more of your life you're willing to let it take from you, she replied softly. Charles and Jenny are already trapped in the misery they've created for themselves. But you're not. Her words settled over him like a balm. Caleb didn't reply immediately, letting the thought sink in. The truth was, he didn't crave revenge anymore. The damage had been done. Both Charles and Jenny were already living with the consequences of their actions. But closure? That was far harder to define. Maybe closure isn't about forgiving them, Layla said, her voice steady and soothing. It's about freeing yourself from their shadows. Maybe it's about finding forgiveness for yourself, not for what they did, but for believing in them, for letting the hurt seep in. Caleb tilted his head in quiet thought. That might be it. The following morning he embarked on a long walk, his steps carrying him through the labyrinth of his memories. He considered his family, the painstakingly rebuilt pieces of his life, and the decisions that had steered his path. Charles's revelation still echoed in his thoughts, as did Jenny's actions. But as Caleb walked, he began to grasp that closure wasn't some grand or ceremonial event. It didn't demand apologies or validation from others. Instead, it was a quiet, deliberate act, a decision to leave the past where it belonged. Time moved on, and one day Caleb stood beside a serene lake. Layla was there too, her calm presence a grounding force. They were attending a charity event Caleb had helped bring to life, an endeavor he'd thrown himself into as a way to rediscover purpose and give back. The setting sun cast golden streaks across the water's surface, a tranquil reminder of renewal. Layla gave his hand a soft squeeze and asked, "How are you doing?" Caleb's lips curved in a subtle smile. "I think I'm okay," he replied. Her face lit up with an unguarded, radiant smile. Resting her head on his shoulder, she whispered, "That's good." In another part of the world, Jenny and Charles remained ensnared in their own spirals of regret and bitterness. Their choices weighed heavily, a persistent reminder of all they had forfeited. But that burden was theirs to carry. Caleb's burden had been different. His was the challenge of rising above his pain, reclaiming joy and meaning, and he had succeeded. The wounds of the past had left their mark on Caleb, a scar that spoke of hardship, but also of perseverance. It was no longer a shackle tethering him to resentment. He had made the choice to release it, to claim peace, not for their sake, but as a gift to himself. Standing by the lake, his eyes fixed on the glowing horizon, Caleb felt a profound sense of release. For the first time in what seemed like ages, he truly felt free. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.